Hi, welcome to Kotlin Thursdays. I'm your host, Matt Moore, and I'm starting on a series with Kotlin Thursdays on functional programming. Now, functional programming excites me quite a bit. It allows you to write cleaner code that's easier to understand because it follows a more declarative style of coding where you focus more on what you want to accomplish and less on how to accomplish it. And it'll help you have more bug-free code. Code that's easier to debug and understand and reason about. So what better way to get started with functional programming than to take a look at functions? Now, Kotlin, like a lot of other languages, has support for a variety of different types of functions. So in this episode, we're going to cover named functions in Kotlin. In future episodes, we'll cover anonymous functions, and then we'll talk about lambdas and see what kind of cool stuff we can do with those. So you can kind of think of functions in Kotlin like mini programs of sorts. They're little bits of code that you can organize together and run to do various tasks that you want your program to do. Functions are particularly useful for organizing your code. So if you have a specific piece of code that's going to do something over and over and over again, rather than copying and pasting that code all throughout your program, you can write a function with that code and then have the rest of your program just call the function. In Kotlin, and in a lot of languages, you have the first function that starts your program. It sort of kickstarts it, and that function is usually called main. Now the main function allows you to call other functions as well that you can define as custom functions throughout your code. So let's take a look at the main function in Kotlin. First, you're going to want to open up a text file on your computer, and let's call our text file funwithfunctions.kt. Now inside this funwithfunctions.kt file, we're going to go ahead and print the following code. Now this code is going to be our main function. As we mentioned before, that main function will let us kickstart our program. It'll be the entry point that allows us to run the rest of our Kotlin code. So once you've got this main function written here in your text editor, you can save that file. And then we need to go ahead and compile that file. Now the way we do that is we go to the command line, and on the command line we'll enter this particular command here. We're using the Kotlin C-JVM compiler command, and we pass these options here. You'll notice that the include runtime option is added. That basically tells Kotlin compiler that when we finish compiling our code, we want this to be an executable that we can actually run on our computer. The next option, the -d option, will allow us to specify the name of the file that we want to generate. This will be our executable jar file. For those who aren't familiar with JVM, typically when you compile a Java type language, and Kotlin is a Java-based language, you go ahead and compile it to a jar file. And this jar file is what you can then run using java-jar. So once we've compiled this, we run java-jar, and then we pass in the name of our file. So now that we've written a basic Kotlin file with the main function, let's go ahead and write our own custom function and see how that works. So we'll create this custom function over here, and it's called myFirstFunction. And we'll go ahead and enter some code to run in that function. Now, once we're done with that, we can then call this function from our main method. So to do that, let's go ahead and save our text file. Let's recompile that, and we'll go ahead and run it. And you'll see that we get our output now. Okay, now that we've gotten some basic experience with using the Kotlin compiler and writing our own custom functions and calling them from main, let's go ahead and take a dive into higher order functions. So basically what you do with higher order functions is, whereas a normal function can take any kind of parameter in that you want to then do something with, for example in this case, we have a basic hello world example where we're passing in a name parameter, and we can go ahead and greet the name of the person that we pass in. Now this is how most normal functions work. You pass it a parameter and it can do something with that parameter. With higher order functions, instead of just passing, say, a name in or a number, for example, we also have the ability to pass in another function. So if we define our custom function, we can then take that function and pass it as a parameter to our new function, and that will then run that function from inside the other function. So here we're creating a function called a, and this function just returns a string. Next, we create a function called b. Now, b function can actually accept another function as its parameter. You may notice here in the type signature for the parameter we pass into b, it has parentheses that are empty, this arrow notation, and then it says string after it. That basically means that this parameter can accept a function that itself will return string. That's what the empty parentheses means with the arrow notation. Now, the empty parentheses specifically says that the function we're accepting itself does not accept any parameters. So b will accept a function that accepts no parameters and returns a string. Now you'll notice inside function b, we're returning the parameter that we passed in, and we're calling it with the parentheses on the end. This will execute the function that we're passing in, that's named parameter in this case, and return the result from that. So we can call the function b and pass the function a into it. If we go to our main function here, here's how it would look. We type print line, and we put in the b inside the parentheses to the print line, and in the parentheses to the b, we're going to pass in a. Now you'll note that I'm putting a double colon in front of the a. This is the standard syntax in Kotlin that tells our compiler that we are actually passing a named function that we've defined somewhere else. In this case, we defined it further up above. So Kotlin will take the b function here in our print line, and it will execute it passing in the a. Of course, b will take a, and it will execute a as well, and then return the result from that. So far, we've looked at passing functions as parameters into other functions. But what about functions that return other functions? After all, high-order functions are functions that will either accept another function as a parameter or will return a function. So in this example, we have a function c. Now, function c doesn't take any parameters, but it does return a function. And you'll notice here we have the parentheses as the return type on function c, and then the arrow notation with the string afterwards. That signifies that it returns a function that itself does not accept any parameters, but will return a string. And then you'll notice that in C's definition, we say return : a. Again, we need that : to tell Kotlin that the a function has already been defined elsewhere, and we should simply return that function. Now let's go to our main function here, and we'll actually call the c function. So we type print line, and we put the c inside of there, and then we put the parentheses after it. Now the interesting thing here is adding the parentheses after the c function one time will simply return the function that c returns, namely, it'll return function a. We need to actually execute that function that gets returned to us, so we add a second set of parentheses to execute that function a. To try to make it clear what's going on here, let's write this slightly differently. Instead of calling print line with c and two sets of parentheses, let's instead assign c with parentheses to another variable here, and we'll call that variable my returned function. Now, if we take my returned function and we print it, you'll notice that it shows it is a Kotlin function, but it doesn't actually execute it. So what we want to do is execute that particular function that gets returned. Here, where Kotlin is saying it's returning another Kotlin function, that's the function a that we had defined earlier. So now we'll take that function and we'll add parentheses to it and print that result out. And you'll see now we actually get our string result that comes from a. Okay, that's about all we have time for today. But next week, we're going to talk about anonymous functions, and then we'll talk about lambda syntax. And we'll kind of compare what those two things are and how they differ to standard named functions. So thanks for watching this week's episode of Kotlin Thursdays on functional programming. I'm your host, Matt Moore, and I hope to see you next week.